Hello, my name is Imani. Welcome to PM Express. They set out to achieve two core objectives. One of them to help the voter to take an informed decision as we head into the elections in December. The other one is to help the politicians to become more reflective and more accountable and to make more realistic, espouse more realistic political views. I'm talking about Imani. Have they achieved those objectives? Is this part of that grand agenda to portray the governing party in a bad light in the hope that it will inure to the political benefit of some other group? Or this is purely the job of an active civil society organization? When we come back from the break, I will introduce two guests from Imani. They will answer all our questions. Stay tuned. You're welcome back. We are talking Imani's research into the NDC's 2012 manifesto. Two gentlemen. One of them, Brian Jansi. He is a researcher and a social media manager. Brian, welcome to PM Express.
Thank you.
And then Festus Akwete. Festus, welcome. Festus is the head of the Center for Social Policy at Imani. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Let me start with Brian. Apart from the two objectives that are set out, were there any other things that you sought to achieve with this work?
Well, as you already stated in your introduction, one main thing we really wanted to find out was, after the NDC have promised about 540 of those promises in 2012, it was on those bases that we voted them into power. So we wanted to assess how have they achieved in performing those promises they made to us. That is one key objective. Now, if we, after the assessment has been done, this information will be relevant to the voter going forward into the 2016 election. That if you gave the NDC their mandate in the past 4 years and they've been able to achieve X amount, are you confident to give them the mandate, to continue in 2016, or you want to try another party? So those are the two key things: information, assessment, and information.
First, why can't you guys just mind your business and let the government be?
Okay, so we can't mind our business simply because as we're in a democratic dispensation and we elect representatives to govern us, and therefore they are accountable to the populace or the electorate who vote for them into power. So therefore, as we, Imani, we're more or less like a voice that will always want to demand accountability from the politicians in shaping the development of the country.
And you have clothed yourselves with this responsibility to hold the people accountable.
We hold the
yes, hold the authorities accountable.
Yes. It wouldn't be an easy task, but with continuous sustained effort, we should be able to be demanding much more accountability, because it takes the electorate, the resources of the electorate, to put them there, and then at the end of the day, is the onus on them to account to
and Festus, you took the entire manifesto for the elections 2012 as put out by the governing NDC, and you distilled all their promises into 540 promises. And after all of the things that you did, you awarded them a score of 52.9%. How did you come to put in weights or percentages to each of the 540 promises that were made?
Okay, so that takes us to our methodology, how we did the work. So first thing we did was to set out our yardstick. What are we going to use to do this analysis? And that's purely by their manifesto. So we took their manifesto, we studied it, they divided it into 4 main teams. So one of the teams is putting people first. And we divided that team into education and social policy, because in 2012, education was one key policy issue going into the election.
Partly because of the MPP's promise of a free SHS.
Of course. Then there was expanding infrastructure, according to that team. And there's building strong and resilient economy, and transport and transparent and accountable governance. So we broke into 5 teams.
You took their
There are four teams, and we broke it into 5 teams.
Because you broke the first one, which is social, and broke it into two.
Because education was really important in 2012 election. Yeah. So having done that, what we did then was to now set out our framework. So we have come up with the teams. So our framework was simply looking at these teams and putting weights to them. We used a weighted average method in doing this work. And our weighted average method is one of the most common methodologies used in projects such as this. It's very reliable, and if it's used over a period of time, you'd get consistent results. So what we did was, for governance...
Let me pick one of those, weighting. And for me, it's controversial. For the economy, you weighted the economy 25. And for education, you weighted it 15.
Yeah.
How do you determine that the economy should carry a weight of 25 and the education should carry a weight of 15?
Okay, so answering that question, one thing you might pay or get to know is that when it comes to economy and then more or less governance, when you have a stable economic condition and you have stable governance or a good governance system, it then reinforces the other indicators. Because, for example, if the economy is not performing well and the leadership is not, what do you call it, the one that you can write home about, invariably has more effect on the education and social policy and infrastructure components. So
there is a cascading effect.
Yes, to that effect. So therefore, that's why we really assign with, and more or less, the literature we used was the compendium of the OEC country report, which normally talks about welfare of, what do you call it, economists and all that. So that is the more reason why we assign higher weight to economy and then governance.
Yeah, Brian, you're making a point before I interrupt.
Yeah, so just to rehash what he said, we did a lot of intensive literature review to find out what has been the way of measuring the well-being of a government. And from the literature review, we saw that governance and economy are the key issues which are most important indicators when you are measuring the well-being of a government. So that's why they had the highest score. So after we came out with each of these indicators, then we came up with our framework. And our framework simply is a summation of the indicator or the team multiplied by the weight. So when you take governance, when you score all the governance promises, you multiply by the weight, and you add that to economy, do it that way, then you find the average. That will give you the final result. Then we went ahead to draw our scale, what we call the Imani scale. Now the scale is what indicates after the final score, the score will fall within a part of the scale. So from 0 to 20 was a failed performance. From 20 to 40 is a poor performance. 40 to 50 is weak. 50 to 60 is a fair performance. 60 to 70 is good performance. 70 to 80, very good. And 80 to 100 is an excellent performance. Now the final thing we did was now to go score each promise. Now because this is an output-based assessment.
And what do you mean by output-based assessment?
So,
Festus,
okay, so with respect to an output-based assessment, so for example, if I promise to give you a pen, and I give you a pen, I have delivered that promise, so I've provided you the pen, it's an output. But when it comes to issue about impact-based assessment, then we are looking at the situation where we need to evaluate the promise based on the condition before the promise was made, when the promise was made, and after the promise has been made, to know whether there has been a change, be it positive or negative.
The effect of the fulfillment or otherwise of the promise.
Yes.
Did I capture it correctly?
Exactly.
Yeah, so ideally that's what impact assessment. So this was just an output-based assessment, just to look at if I promise to give you a pen or I give you a chair and I give you a chair, I have achieved that promise.
And overall, you gave 52.9, which was virtually 53.
Yes.
And you said this was fair performance. Was your marking scheme not too high?
No, I think it's reasonable. It's a reasonable marking scheme. And that's if you look, we had a 20 points between each of the scale, 20 to 40, 40 to 50. But between 40 to 70, we gave a 10-point scale so that it will capture clearly the performance. So I think it's a fair scale we used.
Let's start with governance.
Okay.
You awarded the government 50.7%, and this was fair because it fell within 50.
Yeah.
How did you assess governance? what were the parameters within which you could make an assessment and say, okay, the government has obtained a score of 50.7%?
Okay. So governance had about 11 sub-teams when you look at governance. Yeah. We
11.
had...
So there's a... in defense of territorial integrity, governance infrastructure, national security, and all of that. So let's start with defending territorial integrity. How do you measure that?
Okay, so under that, they made specific promises. So I'll give an example. Just a minute.
Okay, so under each of these ones, the defending territorial integrity, governance infrastructure, national security, gender equity and empowerment of women and all of that, there were specific parameters that the manifesto itself
gave. Yeah. So for instance, they said the promise will sustain the infrastructure development efforts in the armed forces. That's one promise. Then they made a promise will adequately resource the armed forces to participate in national development areas such as housing, construction, and rural development.
So how do you measure sustain, encourage, adequate? How do you measure that? How do you put specific weights to this and on the basis of that come to a conclusion that this is the score?
Okay, so that is where the difficulty is, and that's why an exercise is very important, because a lot of the promises politicians make to us are very vague, like you just said, but we still have to find a way of measuring it. So what we do is that if the promise does not have a specific metrics, we look at international standards. We also read beyond the promise, but we also read the budget to see under that particular promise, what was stated in that section, or maybe for the defense budget, what was stated which is related to that promise. Then based on that and see how it was achieved, then we can give a specific score to that.
First, if the government says they are going to enhance infrastructure development in the Ghana Armed Forces, how are you able to tell how many rooms are needed, how many flats are required, and how many fighter jets are needed, and all of that, so that if they provide X amount of fighter jets, then you can say, okay, the Ghana Armed Forces needed this Z amount, the government provided X. They didn't give you that.
Thank you. So from the promise itself, you could find out that it is a very vague or very open promise. However, like Brian said earlier, you need to look at the parameters. For example, what constitutes the armed forces setup? What are the provisions or interventions which have been made over the past period, of which you then more or less triangulate with information before and after the intervention has been, to be able to ascertain that, okay, fairly they've done this based on the intervention they've done, they merit a score of this or a score. But ideally, such a promise like it will be very difficult for the government to score 100%, because at the end of the day, enhancing is more or less like a continuous exercise.
It's actually more difficult to give any weight at all. You have given them 85%. I guess my point is, how do you come to that? How do you know, okay, if they've bought helicopters,
yes, and
they've bought fighter jets, how do you weight that and give a score?
Like I said, the point has to be, is a lot of promise. So under that sector is 85%. So when you look at one, for example, if you could look at one which it might not perform well. So for example, like the promise you just read about, if they score, let's say 50%, and 50% in a sense that maybe they have provided a number of infrastructure in the military service, but it wouldn't be the optimal one.
Because we don't know how much is needed.
Yes.
So if you provide some, it may just be the case that you've provided 5% of what they needed.
Yes.
But we do not know.
Yes.
So how do we give a score?
No, we give a score. We give a score because at the end of the day, we looked at first, you look at the infrastructure base of the
what they had before,
yes,
and what they now have.
Yeah. In the sense that so that you could measure more or less the progress that have been made with respect to that promise. And like I said, it's expanding. So ideally, one, there isn't time frame to such a promise, and realistically, you wouldn't be able to peg them 100% to tell them that they had fully achieved this promise.
Brian, and for governance infrastructure,
Yeah.
you awarded 90%.
Yeah.
What do you mean by governance infrastructure? How do I conceptualize governance infrastructure?
Okay, so under governance infrastructure, they promise, for instance, to provide an e-government infrastructure, networking the presidency, the ministries, department, agencies. You know, that's what they said they wanted to do, to network the ministry, department, and agencies. And in fact, the government infrastructure was provided. Now we have the parliament, had the e-parliament system has been implemented. That project has been completed.
What does that constitute? Because I do know that even today, if bills come before Parliament, they are printed, hard copy. The MPs can't use the laptops that were provided as alongside the China chairs that we procured.
Well,
and I know that government started this e-Ghana project, and I think that fell in what you are saying. But how?
Well, like you said, it's an output-based assessment. So I think you are drifting into impact.
Because
the promises will provide e-government, e-parliament.
And you say it has been done.
So 90%. That's a score of 1. So another example, we'll modernize the equipment infrastructure and ICT infrastructure in the judicial service. That project has been done. We have the e-judicial service now. So the output of that promise is that the infrastructure being done. So once that is done, and it's not been done fully, so they got some marks. So once that is done, then we reward marks for that. So as to whether people are using the infrastructure well, or whether the infrastructure bringing any impact, well, that's an impact assessment.
And I heard Franklin Kujo saying, well, if you have the resources, you would do the impact assessment as well. Yeah. Okay, let's move away from, because there are a number of things from governance. National security, why did you give 45, which is quite low?
Okay, so 45 would mean that most of the promises stated here were not achieved. So
for national security.
For national security. So for instance, there was a promise.
And apart from national security, there were others that didn't do too well. Narco-terrorism. What is that?
For narco-terrorism, had to do more with the National Narcotics Control Board. There was a promise to convert it into a security agency so that to be able to coordinate with other security agencies. That has not been done. So then they scored very low there. And they were, I think they were
actually scored 15.7% for narco-terrorism.
So there were only about 3 promises there. So once those were not done, and most of the promises were linked to the conversion of NACOP to a security agency. And there were other promises under that which were linked to that. So once the main promises was not done, then most of them will have scored very low.
And the rule of law and justice.
Okay.
My Nigerian friend said I shouldn't say justice, I should say justice. 8.3%. So low.
There was a promise to ensure the Independent Emolument Commission effectively deals with the condition of service for magistrates and circuit courts. Just recently, you know, the judicial service went on a lot of strikes this year. The judges actually complaining of their condition of service. That should clearly tell you that that promise has not been achieved.
We had Justice Atuguba quite recently also talking about conditions of service.
So that promise, for instance, under that, and that's such promise, there was a lot of such promises under that category that were actually not achieved. So that's why they scored very low.
One area that is also of interest to me, and I think Isendo was talking about it at the launch yesterday. Fighting corruption. 33%. And by the scores that you gave, is that a failed mark or that is weak?
30.
This is a 33%.
33 will fall under poor.
Under poor.
Very poor performance.
Yes, so that's poor performance. What were the specific promises in relation to fighting corruption that, in your findings, were not fulfilled? And to that extent, you awarded this poor marks. Okay, we don't quite have the specific,
I don't have that for you.
But
so
we gave
I'll
quite low marks in the fight against corruption.
Okay, so I think I've got one. There was going to be an acquired redevelopment policy to ensure the transparency in the acquisition of public lands.
Okay.
That promise was not achieved.
It was not achieved.
Yeah. There was a promise to comprehensively review the Criminal Offence Act. that has not been fully achieved. That's not been achieved at all.
Since 1960.
Exactly. So a lot of such promises has not been achieved at all. There was supposed to be, the internal audit system was supposed to be revamped, but that has not been done. And just even this evening, there was a program on Joy Connect about how Ghana lost about close to 6 billion over the period of 3 years because of, in the Auditor General's report. That should tell you that this internal audit system we're supposed to revamp has not been done. That's why we still lost a lot of money over this period. So that's why they score very low under public corruption.
Okay, so let's deal with social policy. And I guess that's your area, that's your specific area, social policy, because you are the head of the Center for Social Policy at Imani.
Yes.
You awarded social policy 52, quite close to the overall awards that you gave the government for the implementation of the 2012 manifesto promises. Let's pick the issues one after another and break them down. What are those things that constituted social policy? And here the award is also fair.
Okay, so under social policy, we had, that would be 21 themes under social policy, of which about 117 promises were made to that respect. So you have...
There were so many?
Yes.
117 out of a total of 540.
Yes. So we had, example, mental health, national ambulance service, savannah accelerated development, sports development, youth development,
child labor and street children, women's empowerment.
Yes, and others. Yes, and then if you look at that sector, where they did perform very good was traditional medicine, fighting malaria, and then the expansion of...
Yes, malaria 100%. And
then
traditional medicine 100%. Yes, and then malaria 85%.
Yes, and then expanding program on immunization, because those programs have been at the forefront of the, Ghana Education Service and then the Ministry of Health. Now, with respect to, where they perform poorly, you come to the National Ambulance Service. Now, with respect to the National Ambulance Service, it would interest you to know that over the period, the Director of National Ambulance Service at one point stated that the Ghana Ambulance Service needed 1,000 ambulances. However, some were brought in, and you could find out that at the end of the day, we found out that they were not fit for service.
Those that were parked at Parliament.
Yes.
We were told that I think one of them cost about 85,000 euros.
Yes.
Or 65,000 euros.
Yes, and prior to that, at that point, the number of ambulances available was 160. And as a 2012 report that they issued, the number of ambulances added was 5. So meaning the number of operational ambulances was 165. So therefore, it tells you that only a mere figure of...
So in the period, only 5 ambulances were added to the existing number.
Yes.
And many of these existing numbers are actually grounded, they're not working.
Yes, even some are even grounded, some are even, I just packed, and then some were even returned to the manufacturers who brought the ones in Parliament.
Yes, because the ones at Parliament, we are told that they were not fitted with life-saving equipment.
Yes, so that is respect to. Now when you come to...
SADA, Savannah Accelerated Development Authority.
Yes, and that's
another poor achievement.
Yeah, that's
23%.
Yes, and that is a very interesting score because we all know the issues surrounding the SADA. And with respect to promises and intervention made on SADA, you could see that ideally the programs were not able to be achieved because of the review which went through the corruption issue that went into that. So there was more of like a stall in the activities of SADA. That accounted for the low score of SADA in that respect. Now, in looking at health, for example, the promise which was made was public hospitals with respect to central region and whole being converted to teaching hospitals, of which that they did, because now whole polyclinic is now being upgraded to a teaching hospital, and the Cape Coast Polyclinic has also been upgraded. So that was where they fell very high in respect.
We did poorly in nutrition.
Yes.
15%.
Yes, and with nutrition, why they did poor was the late implementation of we now the school feeding now falls under
Gender Ministry.
Yeah, Gender Ministry, and harmonizing the whole exercise took a whole lot of time. So that really.
But this was just this year. The
yes.
announcement was actually made this year.
Yes, but the component on nutrition did not only capture school feeding alone.
There are many others which didn't do too well. Persons with disabilities didn't do too well. Women's empowerment, 36%.
Yes.
Child development, 43%.
Yes.
Various, wide number of them.
Yes. So when you look at women empowerment, yes, you could, and it also cuts into the governance issue because there was a gender component. But it would interest you to know that the affirmative action which was being propounded and we all look forward to has not been fully achieved in that way because we don't have the 40% representation of women in
that was what was promised in the manifesto.
Yes. So we don't have that promise being achieved.
Social policy. There are so many of the issues there. Have we exhausted them? Youth development.
Okay, so youth development. Well, one interesting thing about youth development, there was the revamp of the youth authority, and then also development of the yes.
YEA.
Yeah, YEA.
There's youth enterprise
support system.
Yeah,
that was achieved with respect to that promise, but with respect to the other ones, they fell really poorly under that.
Wow. Okay, so that's done with social policy. There are so many of them. We can't deal with all of them.
Yeah.
Let's deal with poor execution, infrastructure, and I guess that's your key area.
Yeah, that's my key area.
And I think that infrastructure, they did well, fair because 55%. You awarded 55%.
It's a fair performance.
This is not fair. Yeah, because this government touts its achievements largely in the area of infrastructure. And we have seen a lot of roads. We've seen a lot of roads being done. We've seen a lot of bridges being built, flyovers, school projects, all of these. So in spite of this massive injection of capital in infrastructure, to award them 55% is quite unfair.
Well, I think it's speaking to the data, it's fair because like I said, we have to acknowledge that it's true they did invest a lot of money into infrastructure. But this exercise was done mainly on their manifestos. So for instance...
And they did a lot of things outside the manifesto. They told you that the last time.
Yeah, but like you said, when I was explaining the methodology, our yardstick is the manifesto. So we cannot include other things which were not included, which were done but were not in the manifesto in our analysis.
Okay, I want you to hold that thought. I'll take a break. When we come back, I'll be asking Brian, in spite of the massive injection of capital by this government in infrastructure, and we have seen massive road projects, why did Imani give the government 55%, which is just a fair performance, 55% in infrastructure? You're watching PM Express. We'll be back. You're welcome back. You're watching PM Express, and we are discussing Imani's output-based assessment of the NDC's elections 2012 manifesto promises. 540 of them, they've given a score of 52.3%, almost 53%, a fair performance. I'm talking to them. They're answering the questions, but I have to pick some of the your own assessment of their work. This is Aziz Donla from WA, and he says, Imani did a very fantastic job. It's obviously clear that they were not whimsical and capricious in their research. This is Aziz Donla. He sent us that from WA. This one says, I'm surprised at this high score. It makes me feel Ghanaians have not learned our lessons. This is pure intellectual fraud. This noble think tank that I respected so much is turning itself into another NDC poodle. I'm scandalized as a Ghanaian. I will rate the research itself at 7.9. This is Sami who. Somebody has very harsh words. He says this is intellectual dishonesty because he thinks the scores are outrageously high and undeserving. But before we went on the break, Brian, we were looking at your score for government's infrastructure. My contention is this government pats itself on the back, and we have seen evidence of the work it has done in the areas of infrastructure, and yet you've awarded 55% when the government itself awards itself 80% in terms of overall manifesto pledge. You gave 52.3 and 0.9, and then in the area of infrastructure, you are giving 55.
Okay, so under infrastructure, 119 promises were made in all.
119
promises. And this were divided into 5 parts. We have energy, they did 20 promises, housing, 22, water and sanitation, 29, transport, 26, and ICT, 22. So their highest performing under infrastructure was aviation, and under transport. No, the highest was under ICT, sorry. And
ICT.
so let's start from
ICT. Highest is aviation. Aviation is 90%.
Okay, so aviation falls under transport. Okay. So I wanted to take the sub-team, okay. ICT. So under ICT, they broke it down according to the manifesto into 2 parts. We have the ICT infrastructure and the knowledge economy. So under ICT infrastructure, they had a score of 75%. So they scored very high there under ICT infrastructure. And under the knowledge economy, they had 33.3% because they didn't score quite well there. So let me take you through the details so that I'll make it quite clear.
Let's take maritime and riverine transport,
okay.
50%. What were the specific promises under these two, if we know? The specific promises under maritime and river transport, on the basis of which you scored them 50%, and then we can do aviation, which was 90%. What did they promise under aviation?
Well, under aviation, that was interesting. They promised to upgrade the Tamale Airport into an international airport. And that happened? That has been done. They promised to upgrade Kumasi. They promised to upgrade the Kotoka. You know, that's been done. So that's a very high score.
Drone in Ho.
Exactly.
Was that part of the promises? It was
no, it was not part of it.
It's one of the things they are doing outside.
So we cannot grade it here.
Okay.
Okay. So they also promised to ensure that Ghana complies with international safety and security standards and all of that was done. And also promised to do a feasibility studies for the new airline they wanted to start. Their promise was a feasibility studies. That has been done.
The feasibility study has been done.
So then that's a high score. Okay. So if you just look at the heading alone, and you say, why did we give a high score? Why did we give a low score? Then it will be misleading.
But what you are pointing out actually shows they've done extremely well. In the area of aviation, for example, 90%, that's a high score.
Yeah, but the promise under aviation is to do a feasibility studies. And for an output assessment, once you've done that, that's a 1%.
Great.
So then it becomes very high. So we could take the ICT infrastructure.
I would have preferred we do railways. Railways, you gave 70%. Or if you want to deal with ICT infrastructure, let's deal with that. Then we can come and do railways. And then we do rural housing, urban housing, and then the rest of it. So for the ICT infrastructure, they promised to invest a lot into the building of the national ICT infrastructure. So they completed a national data center. That has been done. They completed. They promised to strengthen its institutional regulation framework for managing the ICT sector. About 4 policies were actually brought out during the period: the mobile virtual networking operating licenses, the Postal and Courier Service Regulation Commission regulator. All those, about 4 of them has been done. So that promise is actually achieved. They promise the Eastern Corridor fiber optic backbone that has also been done. Been laid. Yeah. So they also promised to convert most of the post office, the old post offices, to ICT centers. I think that's about 72% complete because there are a few of them under completion who have not been done. They also promised to do the business processing outsourcing. Yes, which is what they are doing around Circle. Exactly, that has been done. So then that's why they scored very high in the ICT infrastructure, because most of the promises, another one is an e-government project, e-health project. Yeah, it was done in WA. It was also done in Colib. It was piloted. The promise was to pilot it. So once that has been done, it's been done. So 75%. Yeah, I explained that. Let's deal with railways. And I think the railways is absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
And railways to 70%. Just like feeder roads did 57%, and then urban roads 70%. For urban roads, for example,
Yeah.
do we know what the specific promises were and how we came to the conclusion that the amount of work done so far merits a score of 70%?
Okay, so for the urban roads, they did not specifically state each of the roads they were going to do. So the promise was to construct, rehabilitate, and maintain urban roads. Now, how did we score? So we went into the budget. Then we look at all the roads under the urban centers, and we calculated the total number of.
But if there's an urban road which they don't put in the budget, you will not see, you will not know about it, and so you can score.
That is why they didn't get 100%. So we acknowledge that all the urban roads, they didn't say they are going to do all the urban roads. So the only way you can hold them accountable is look at what money has been allocated for in the budget to do urban roads. So based on looking at the budgets, also look at the kilometers which has been completed. So you look at the total kilometers for that urban road, the kilometers completed, then you can strike your fraction, which will be made into a percentage.
How do we classify an area as urban?
The classification is done based on the Ghana, Ghana Urban Authority. They classify the roads which are urban roads, feeder roads. So, and this classification is done clearly in the budget. And also when you read their annual reports, it clearly states which roads they consider as urban, which are feeder, and which are so
we are actually
highways.
Picking the government's own script and marking it against itself, because that's what we have done. Because if they've promised to do urban routes, and then we go and take a budget presented by themselves, and in this budget they say they are going to do X, Y, Z routes, and then we go and say, okay, have they done those routes?
Well, what other tool can you use to measure the urban roads? For instance, if we did not only, like, we did a triangulation of our data. So we looked at the budget, that's one source. Then you look at the annual report of the budget, or annual report of the ministry, sorry. They also look at media reports on this road. So that's that triangle. So you look at the disparity between that, and you figure out the actual percentage of road completed. For instance, in some cases, they may state this X amount has been completed. But when you check from media reports, we cannot actually go on the ground to check every urban road. So we rely sometimes on the media report. You could tell that this road has not actually been completed. So you strike the difference using this triangulation method. You're able to tell exactly what percentage of roads have been completed at the urban sector, and you're able to give your score. That's what we did. So we did not only rely on what was in the budget alone.
Okay, let's pick something which is, for the first time looking through all the scores, this is the only one I have seen that you have scored 0. Upgrading slum and the prevention of sin.
Yeah.
0.
Exactly.
How was that? What was promised and what was not delivered? What was promised and not delivered, to the extent that you can give this? Festus, you want to come in on this one?
No, he should. So when we get to the economy, then.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so the promise was to upgrade slums, urban slums.
Sodom and Gomorrah, those kinds of areas.
And that promise from our checks has not been done. Those upgrade and relocate. Well, the market has been relocated, but the slum itself has not been upgraded, and has not been relocated and has not been upgraded. So that promises were not actually initiated at all.
But if the market has been relocated, at least some 0.5% or something.
No, the promise was not to do with the market. It was to do with the dwelling,
the slum
itself. Yeah, so that promise was not actually done at all. So that's why they had a 0 there.
Sanitation, 30%, which is poor performance.
Poor performance. Under sanitation, the key promise there was to establish a national sanitation authority. And under that, there were promises under that. So the National Sanitation Authority has not been established. And the idea was
But we have a National Sanitation Day.
Yeah, but the promise, we are still sticking to the manifesto. The promise was to establish a National Sanitation Authority, which will be an autonomous energy and agency under the local government service to coordinate all the activities of sanitation, in this government. That promise was not achieved. So all the promises which fall under that, for instance, sanitation for all comparts, were all linked to that sanitation authority. Once that has not been done, then they'll score low in all of those other
rural
promises.
water to 28%, which is also weak.
Yeah.
Sanitation is 30%, we've said that. Water resource management, 38%.
Well, the interesting thing about water is that actually the government has invested heavily into water, the water infrastructure, and that must be stated clearly. But when you look at the exact promises they made, so one promise was urban water. They're going to upgrade the urban water projects, the pond rehab, the pond expansion of pond water works. That has been done. A lot, and most of them, about the 1 billion which was invested in the water projects, were mainly based on the urban water, and that project has been done. So they scored,
and other areas.
yeah, they scored very high. But promises such as they promised a water fund, that has not been done. So then it brings your total score lower, even though you score very high under urban water. There was also a promise to drill about 20,000 boreholes. Only 33,000 of that boreholes have been drilled. So you realize that that's under rural water. So then the score will be high, even though urban water was done very high. So people say the government invested heavily into urban water. There was the Nungwa desalination plant, which also completed. That's a high score. But the overall score will be low because the other key promises in that sector they scored very low.
There was a promise of knowledge evolution, which you scored 33%.
Yeah.
What did this entail?
Okay. The main thing under that was they promised to, first of all, establish a fund for science, technology, research. That fund has not, actually no money has been allocated for that fund, so they scored very low there. They also promised to complete the KNUST, the Cape Coast. They also build a technology park at Cape Coast, at KNUST campus. They also promised one at the Crapping Ridge. That project has not actually been started, so they scored very low there. So those are some of the promises.
Yeah, renewable energy as well.
Yeah.
They did well in oil and gas development, and then in power, because oil and gas development 76%,
yeah,
and then power 68%. I think we should do the economy. And there were quite a number of issues in relation to the economy. And I think I'll come to Festus on this one. Festus, what constitutes your measurement? And in the economy, you gave 43%?
Yes.
Why? Because 43 is one of the lowest in terms of the subcategories.
Yes.
Because it's one of the lowest. It's actually the lowest. Yes. Why is that?
Okay, so under economy first, it had 211 promises, of which it was broken down into 41 themes. So, for example, you have maintaining a robust macroeconomic fundamentals, and that's where they perform very, very poor, not even poor, they failed woefully. Now, the promises there was an average GDP growth of at least 8% per annum.
Yes. And
it will interest you to know that over the past period, we've never achieved that, what do you call it? That growth.
Yes, but in 2013, we did 7.6, which was close to 8%.
The promise was average of 8%. So ideally, over the period, we should aim that every year will be 8%.
Or more.
Yes. So
7%, 7.6%.
No, average. We are talking about average. So if there's an increase and decrease, if you should strike an average over the period, so 2004, 2015, 2016, you should get an average growth of 8%, which
and precisely because, especially last year, the growth was 3.9.
Yes.
And this year's projection is that we are not going to do even 4%, which means we can achieve.
And then moving forward, you have a single-digit inflation, and the results we've had is 9.2, 11.4, 15.4, 17.1, and then currently are hovering around 16%.
16.9, yeah.
So you can see that now an overall budget deficit of 5% of GDP. And it will interest you to know that over the period, we've had 11.6, then 11.6.
When we say deficit, we're actually talking about deficit largely tends to be spending money we don't have, isn't it? For the layman's understanding.
Yes.
When we do our budget, we are saying that we will spend more than the money we will have by at least 5%. That was the target.
Yes.
Because in previous years, from 2012 down, we did 11.6%, 11%, 10 point something. all down, down, down. So we've been in double digits.
Yes.
So the target was to cut it down to about 5%.
Yes.
But it's now hovering. The target this year is actually to do 6%.
6%, yes, because last year they did 6.7. Now, such a promise, you would say that has been missed. Now, gross reserve of what do you call it, 4 months cover, that hasn't been achieved because best we had 3.1, we had 3.6, 3.5, and then 3.5 over the period. That's 3 months, 3.5 months cover. So on an average, you've not really achieved the 4 month cover. And then last but not the least, under maintaining a robust economy was to increase the per capita income to, what do you call it, $2,300 by the year 2017. And over the period, we've had 1,642, 1,830, 1,440, 1,380 over the period. And clearly, it will be looking at the projections and the permutations with respect to growth, it would then reinforces the point that we will not be able to achieve such a promise. So that's where they perform very bad there. Now moving forward, you go to a section like where they did well, which was road tax force, and they scored 100%. And the simple promise there was to involve the youth in what do you call it, traffic management in the country. And you can bear witness to the national.
We have seen national service
being what do you call it, carrying out such an.
So for the high score areas, those were that one, Rural Safety Task Force, the security, rural and agriculture finance.
Yes.
Rural and agriculture finance. What we do know that in 2014 at least, fertilizer subsidy was not done, and even last year it was done. Partly, it was actually done late. It was late. How do we still score rural agriculture finance as? How do we score them high marks? Because it looks very difficult to justify that.
So the promise was to the score they had there was 38%, and the promises were provide the framework to ensure adequate flow of funds, and no such framework had been in place. So such an intervention, they didn't score high. Accelerate the provision of farming and fishing inputs to agriculture-related, infrastructure services. Now, inputs have been provided, but one thing we realized or we noticed from the report that the frequency is a bit low. So on that point, they didn't really score a high mark. They scored an average score. Now provide incentive for youth in agriculture to become more commercial oriented. And that's where the yes fund component comes into play, because some of the funds were given to youth in agri initiative. So in the nutshell, that was why.
There's something, I'm just picking from your report. You're talking about AGI. You are citing one of your, in justifying these marks, especially for the economy. You said AGI consistently complains about taxes. Really, how can you base an argument on AGI's complaints?
Okay, so with respect to AGI, what we sought to look out, or what we look out to say was simply reinforcing the promises which they made and it not being achieved. So, for example, if you have a single-digit inflation and then budget issue, because at the end of the day, those macro indicators then have effect or cascading effect on the business index or business performance of an economy. So, for example, now that you have a high budget deficit, therefore you need a component to finance it, therefore borrowing and crowding out the private sector and all that.
You say you are listening in promises in terms of companies that they were seeking to revamp, which hasn't happened. Kita Salt Industrial Estate uncompleted, Commander Sugar, Commander implemented, Valco operating under capacity, Abosu Glass Factory and other companies abandoned for years. Was there a specific promise in the 2012 manifesto to revamp all of these companies within the 4 years?
There was a promise to revamp.
We can take out Commander because Commander has been done. Yeah,
Commander has been done. Yeah, there was a promise to revamp old industries which were not.
Abosi Glass Factory.
Yeah, but it wasn't specifically stated. But revamp. So ideally, if you look at the companies and industries which were not really functioning, and then you look at whether they have been done or not. That's what on the basis of which we scored them.
Okay, let's deal with education. We don't have too much time left, just about 4 minutes to go.
Okay.
Education.
Yeah.
And you scored 69. That's about the highest.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Education, 69.
Yeah.
How did you come to that? And you were pointing out that education was a key area in last year's election. That was the reason why you decoupled it to stand alone as a separate thematic area. What were those things that were done in education to the extent that you awarded almost 70%? Because it's 69.4.
Okay, so with respect to education, first, the number of promises under education was 59, which was divided.
You guys classified them into 12.
No, it was stated clearly in the manifesto that it was
okay.
12. So we had something like primary and junior secondary education. We had teachers, we had polytechnic and tertiary education, learning improvement and all that. So on that scale, where they scored a high mark was non-formal
education.
Yeah, and the simple promise was to convert it to an agency. And then we had distance learning and open schooling. And the intervention which had been carried out is the provision of 13 centers for open schooling for both teachers and then junior high school level. Now, when it comes to tertiary education, the simple promise there was to make polytechnics, the 10 polytechnics, and
we knew that 4 have been converted.
No, actually 8 has been
8.
converted. Initially it was 6, but just last week Thursday, the Ministry of Education added. Did they buckle
under political pressure? That's a political question. That's a political question. You won't answer.
I wouldn't want to say that, but they added Cape Coast Polytechnic and then Tamale Polytechnic. Now, where they perform low was secondary education, and rightly so. The
community day schools.
Yeah, much talked about. Now, the issue is, as of August 2016, the number of schools commissioned was 10. However, per the Ministry of Education, 27 are ready for admission for this.
In fact, the minister said 32. Ablakwa, he's a deputy education minister. He actually said 32.
Yeah, but in their report, or in their documentary, counting the number of schools which were ready was 27. Added to the 10, that gives you 37.
Okay.
Yes.
Because he said 32, and he said this on Joy FM Super Monusha. He was saying that 32 of them were good enough to admit students, and they had actually been given the go-ahead to admit students in this, this academic year.
Yeah, so such an intervention, which was largely the flagship promise of the manifesto, they scored very low there because the promise was to establish or build 200 schools in areas where do not have such facilities.
Our time is up, Festus. In spite of what you point out, they still did extremely well in education, 69.4%, as compared to 43.4% in economy and 55% in infrastructure, and overall score of 52.3%. I think that you guys did a great job. Thank you, Festus. Thank you, Brian. God willing, we will bring you another exciting discussion on PM Express. Until then, my name is Imani Kabas Dabu. Bye-bye. Guys, shall I turn?